So good afternoon. I don't know how many of you participated in yesterday's debate in Lund, and how many participated in the discussion this morning about women in international diplomacy. Because if you did, I hope you will follow the logic of how all these three discussions fit together. Not because everything we say, but the importance of these issues, how they come together to create the hope for a better world. Now, we all have taken guidance from the question. Some people have reformulated it. Can we create a better world? Can I make a better world, etc. I think I'm going to demonstrate to you that at least in some aspects, the world is getting better. And I will do that, yes, and I will do that just by sharing with you some of the perspectives on disasters and the work that has been done over the past 30 years by countries, communities, and a fairly discreet, not very visible group of scientists, because many of them drifted onto something called climate change and forgot that disaster risk is actually one of the major consequences of climate change. But that's politics. Let me first say, how do you look at disasters? What is it? Because that's really is the most important question you ask yourself. Is it a humanitarian crisis that you respond to with your heart, you pay off, and you go home? That's one way, and a very common way of dealing with disasters. The other way of dealing with disasters, which is where we have gone in the international community and countries over the past 30 years, is disasters is a major, major development challenge and constraint. Yes, people die. Buildings die, infrastructure is destroyed, agricultural output is destroyed, water sources is destroyed. So we've moved from an understanding, let's say 20, 25 years ago, all our thinking on disasters was humanitarian, death and destruction. In order to get more attention to the prevention side, we have to move the attention from the humanitarian to social impact, destruction of social infrastructure, loss of schooling days, loss of health facilities. But that wasn't enough to really get the political attention we've concluded was necessary. So we said, okay, let's move economics. That should move into the bigger investment and decisions required. The beginning, that worked quite well. But there is a major data gap there. And the final piece of this came when I heard a minister say, disasters are political issues because we can lose our job if we fail to respond to disasters properly. And when a minister says that, it's not me telling him, an international bureaucrat, I say, here we got the agenda for the future. So this whole, how long time did this take? It took about 30 years to move through this whole thing. 30 years of increasing major catastrophes. Why? Not necessarily because nature became more violent, but because our societies are more complex, more exposed, more vulnerable, infrastructure, big cities. Those of you who remember Superstorm Sandy, you know what a wake-up call that was for this sense of invulnerability in sophistication of our modern countries, when New York lost power, lived in total darkness, rule of law became an issue, subway stopped for weeks. You know, that sense of helplessness led to very important changes in also how the private sector views disaster. So this whole perception that disasters is something that happened to poor people, it does for sure. But it also happens to rich people. It happens to poor people worse in rich countries than to rich people in poor countries. So the social inequality about disasters is one of the really critical elements we have now. So when we go from the 1980s, the first UN resolution on the risks of disasters was actually passed in the late 70s or early 80s. So it wasn't that governments didn't, one, have the information, and two, understand that there is something here that is truly disruptive and not really helpful for where we aim to go with our Millennium Development Goals, etc. So did it make it into the mainstream? No, there wasn't much attention to it, except at local level. What happened next was when everyone was ready to give up a bit on this, the Indian Ocean tsunami happened. And that changed the paradigm because disasters have no borders. It is totally unacceptable that plus 200,000 people die like this. Surely we have early warning system technology to warn. And there were a whole set of questions that roll after a different political commitment to move. And that led also to a mobilization of not only governments, but in 2005, January, 4 weeks after the tsunami, I'm pointing at Jonas here because he was your president, because he was a very important Swedish actor after the tsunami, based in Southeast Asia. And what happened was already preset conference established something called the Yoga Framework for Action. What was interesting compared to the debate about yoga was it said to governments what they were supposed to do. Governments supposed to do this, that, and the third, and I will tell you that many of them did, but they left the rest of us in the annex. UN, NGOs, scientists, women, children, all in the annex, everything about governments. So how did it go? Yeah, it went a bit slowly. Policies, discussions. Somewhere there, I started this work myself, and I said, yeah, I think we need a bit more mobilization here. This is not really going to work if we don't get everyone involved. And when I say everyone, literally, I mean everyone. And that has been a very interesting journey, because the question is, in this shift from responsiveness to disasters, we need to have preparedness, we need to be able to save lives, we need to do this, to actually say we can prevent. And what does prevention require? It requires understanding of risk, it requires planning, it requires investments, and it really requires getting everyone involved. And everyone, now we try to think we need social mobilization, push. We need money, we need political power. So who's got political power? Governments. Who's got the money? The private sector. And where are the movers and shakers? It's local governments and their partners in communities. And then we had this missing link of science and research. Somewhere along the way, the scientists really did disappear from this process, which was quite interesting. And I could not really put my hand on where they had gone until I realized it was climate change. That's where the research money was. And we did not have any social scientists, and we didn't have any economists. So that was also mobilization work to broaden the understanding of how to tackle disaster risk. More research was needed, better understanding of the economics, filling the data gap, and the mobilization on social issues. So that's where we started now a number of years ago. The yoga framework had a span of 10 years, from 2005 to 15. In 2011, we had Superstorm Sandy, I think, 12. In 2011, we had the flooding in Thailand. We had this major event in Japan, earthquake. That's okay, I was going to say. It's not really okay, but the Japanese are used to earthquakes. They got good buildings. A tsunami, that was not so okay because it demonstrated certain weaknesses in how they had built their early warning and preparedness system in terms of people's understanding. And thirdly, which was totally unexpected and unacceptable, the impact on the Fukushima power plant, which demonstrated something that we only started talking about very slowly, a huge weakness in the governance system, about institutional responsibility, about accountability, about the understanding of risk and safety. Risk and safety. So the combination of these mega events, I think, focus people's mind. But is this the full story? No, because who actually pays for disasters? That's the stories that never reach you front page of newspapers, and therefore data collection started very slowly, but it's going on now. It's the poor people in the world, of course. Poor countries lose proportionally much more financially and socially than rich countries because they have less to take from. So you will have a Caribbean island easily losing 160% of the GDP on a hurricane, the banana crop and the tourism infrastructure pulled out. Guess how long time it takes for them to recover? What happens, because they are relatively wealthy countries, they are not poor enough to get the grant, so they get offered a loan from the World Bank to rebuild the infrastructure. And before the World Bank has done the feasibility study, taken decisions, etc., 2 years pass. They get the money, they start, and another hurricane hits. So that's a bit the story of their life. You will have the same thing in many other small island states, in agricultural countries. So the conclusion that the people who are looking at this now very consistently draws is that disasters always leave people poorer. There is a myth which has some bearing in reality that the reconstruction generates an economic boom. But it's a very short-term boom, because the jobs that are lost are never recovered. New jobs may be created, but there is no certainty. So we can give you masses of examples on that. But I wanted to take you to the next iteration of this risk understanding, which actually strengthen this perspective where I started. Disasters are a development challenge. And if we don't treat them as such, we will never come to grips with what has to be done. So when in 2011 or so, I said, now we got 4 more years to go, and I asked people, do you think this is it? Is the job done? Can we shut down? Should we just continue as we have started? Or do we need to look at the instrument that we have? And everyone said, no, so much has changed. We need to check, we need to fix again. So when you start looking at what governments, above all governments actually, have done during these 10 years, and that's why I want to give you a sense of things happen and change. So many of them have changed their legislation to try to get a grip on this risk and prevention issue and development. They've introduced new policies. They try to fix institutions. But this takes time. Change legislation and get it out there is not a matter of 2 years. So they said, yes, many things have happened, but be careful, we just started, go easily, don't change everything, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. But still what they wanted to achieve, and not only governments, but they said we have to tackle this issue that climate change and disaster risk are treated as separate issues. It sounds a bit silly to us because we know the reality, but politically, institutionally, financially, it was very separated. It's much better now after the Paris conference. Paris wiped away a lot of these things. Second thing, which is even more difficult, we have to break down the barriers between development planning and disaster risk management. And if you think about it, any country, you don't treat building disaster risk management institution and risk understanding separate from your development planning. That's the foundation of sustainability and stability. So this concept, and I could give you the theory where I think it comes from, is a very destructive one, and it's even more difficult to change. This is everyone's evidence. I used to say to people, go to the SDG discussions and get your input there. And they say, yeah, we are trying, but no one is listening to us. Yeah, we are trying, but no one is listening to us. So, cultures, different ways of thinking, defensiveness, money. If I share an example with you from the meeting we had once, bringing the climate community and the disaster community together in preparation for this integration in reality. Good discussions, a little bit feeling their way. And at the end of the meeting, and I thank her, a very courageous person, she put up a hand and said, does this mean that all the climate money will now go to the disaster people? So that's somewhere at the bottom of her heart. Genuinely, she was worried that this integration could not really be held together. And this was in the Pacific, but I have a similar example from Sweden, actually. But I won't go into that. So then the third and fourth thing that they really wanted to do, and that will be encouraging for you. One government said, we are building and building, but we don't know if we not get any better. We don't actually know if we are getting more, and we need to be measured. We need to have standardization system. We want to have international standards against which we can measure ourselves in this area. And this is very unique. Who has ever heard governments ask for standards against which they want to measure themselves? But they did. So now we have them. And as a consequence, there was already an initiative to establish an ISO for resilient cities. And the work that has just been finalized on setting global targets to achieve and the indicators against which countries will measure themselves. And then there were many other things. But finally, just to link to what we've talked about earlier today, is this issue of who is involved to move the agenda. If only governments are expected to drive this, it won't work. And they say that themselves. Yes, we are accountable, but we can't do it alone. So who else was there? No longer in the annex, in the Sendai framework that Mo mentioned, that was agreed in 2015. Everyone was moved into the center of the agreement. And who is everyone? Well, business participated very proactively in the negotiation. So they've got very important commitments put in there. Women was a bit, how do you deal with this women issue? We never really went into the gender discussion because we said this is actually about women's participation. And how do you situate it? Because the profession of disasters tend to have a lot of men in it where it comes from. Hard hats, trucks, ropes, search and rescue have traditionally been, not anymore of course, but very much men. So men tended to be the leaders in these institutions. So how to motivate women professionally to join? Typically, as you know, women at community level are dominant organizers. In Japan, when they looked at this after the tsunami, they found that they had, at the lowest level community organizers, about 25% women. And then when it came to the next level, 11%. And to the top management, 2% women. This is Japan. One of the most sophisticated countries in the world when it comes to disaster management. But actually, so professionally, the whole area of work will benefit from the development perspective, getting economics, politics, will benefit also from widening the diversity and really the promotion of women is going there. And then young people, persons living with disability, everyone has a say. So it's been a real mobilization that is clearly reflected in the agreement. And the agreement is not only, it's not telling them what to do. It's ask them, what are you going to do to contribute? So the final message to these groups is, so everyone agreed on this. Risk is the most important thing. Governance is critical, it's core. Resilience, social, economic, as looked at the development perspective, and then of course continue to increase and strengthen countries' capability to respond to disasters, which has increased immensely in the past 25, 30 years. But finally, if this governance model that we imagine possible is going to function, don't wait for the government to call you, call them. Otherwise it won't change, because they don't have time. And they don't really know how to figure it out, so you have to help them. So it's trying to empower everyone to keep driving this system, which is only intergovernmental every 10 years. In between the 10 years, it's all up to us. Let me finally quote to you just 5 conclusions from Economist Intelligence Unit. I told you mobilization of the private capital. Superstorm Sandy became the opening moment for business and capital, that disasters actually concern them, also for their own profit and sustainability. And we asked the Economist Intelligence Unit, why do you never mention in your country profiles the risks that countries run from disasters? Why don't you mention earthquakes in Indonesia or volcano eruptions? And the answer was, well, we haven't thought about it. So they started thinking about it, and just last year we finished a common publication where they have actually indexed countries according to certain criteria of how they how their resilience function. So here are the conclusions, and I'll finish with that. A shift in emphasis from disaster response to preparedness is underway. Governments are, with greater frequency, recognizing the critical role of disaster mitigation and preparedness. Political leadership plays an important role in effective disaster risk management. Budget allocations for disaster risk management are rising in many countries, but dedicated budgets are not yet the norm. Disaster risk is highest in countries where vulnerable societies and high exposure to natural hazards coincide, social and hazards. The resilience of the physical environment dictates much of a country's overall disaster risk preparedness. These are just some observations. The report is available on the internet, Economist Intelligence Unit, and they got a ranking. If you got a lot of money to invest, you can actually see how countries manage their disaster risks, which is very exciting. Think if we can do that with the women. Huh? So that's just some of the things that have happened at global level, but none of the things that we've done, we have figured out at a desk in an office. We picked it up all from what people tell us they need, what works, what doesn't work, where we need to push, and where we need to mobilize political commitment at the highest level. Thank you.